Welcome to the Silicon Fox podcast, where we explore the habits and stories of high performers. Join us as we dive into their journeys, analyze live blood tests, and break down the science behind key biomarkers to help you optimize your health. I'm your host, Mitchell Eschner, an ex-pro soccer player, a current sponsored hybrid athlete, a health tech founder, and a longevity enthusiast. Well, hey, Matt, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Hey, Mitchell. Thanks for having me. Excited to be on.
I always like to start these with just like letting you share a little bit of your story. It gives kind of the audience a good understanding of what you've done, what you're interested in. Instead of me covering your accolades, I know you have a lot, but would love to just hear a synopsis of kind of the progressions you've gone through in the health and wellness world and just your background.
Sure. Well, that's probably too generous of an introduction, but I grew up primarily in the Bay Area, then Wyoming for a little bit. My dad's actually been a VC since the late 80s, so I sort of grew up talking about startups at the dinner table and always wanted to be an entrepreneur. I just thought that was the coolest thing you could do. So like a lot of kids in the Bay, I had a bunch of, crap projects in high school that didn't go particularly far. And, kind of along the way, developed a passion for health and fitness. I was a runner at the time, still a runner. And so eventually got to starting a business in that space and sort of the health and fitness space specifically in a gap year between high school and college. That was a supplement business called Momentus. I went to do my first year at school, tried to hire a CEO for the business thinking, hey, I can kind of do both of these things, be in school and kind of continue to run the business with the help of somebody a bit more experienced and professional. Turns out it's extremely difficult to hire a professional CEO for a the sub-$1 million CPG business. I didn't know that really at the time, but turns out it's very difficult. So at the end of my first year, I basically felt like, hey, I can't do both of these things effectively or get the most out of them. And I'd raised an angel round at that time. We had a small number of employees and a product on the market. And so I felt very committed, of course. And so I took an air quotes indefinite leave after my first year to run that business full time. Truthfully, I thought it was probably 50-50. I wouldn't have a job at the end of the next year anyways, in which case, I would have gone back. But we struggled through somehow. And, business continued to grow. I ended up running it for about 5.5 years in total. We went through a merger and then a majority transaction with private equity. I then went to work for a couple of my investors, guys that started a venture firm in San Francisco called Jazz. We're a seed series A firm, about $1 billion under management, focused on not just things in health and wellness, but really broadly anything in and around health, human productivity. And I've been there the last 2.5, coming up on 3 years now as an investor. And part of what attracted me to Jazz was the opportunity to potentially scratch the entrepreneurial itch from time to time as well.
Right.
They don't have a dedicated incubation platform. We're not an incubator the way some businesses or firms are, but occasionally when there's a particular opportunity that we're excited about where there isn't an asset that makes sense for us to invest in, then we'll consider starting that business ourselves or getting involved with an entrepreneur at a stage that otherwise wouldn't really make sense for us. And so I've been fortunate to be a part of 2 of those now. The first was in the financial services space, and the second is brand new business again.
So it was incubated in Jazz Venture Partners?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah. So we brought in a CEO for that about 6 months in, who is much more qualified than myself, thankfully. And the second one that we started last year is called Sett. That's a new business, much more similar to the last one I started in the sort of better for you CPG category, that's launching hopefully next month. I don't know when this is going to air. So next month for anyone listening is like late February.
Yeah. Super exciting. Love it. I want to harp a little bit on Momentus. That was the first kind of bigger thing that you started that really took off a little bit. You said you were an athlete. I think the typical health and wellness entrepreneur is with an athletic background, but like, what was the inspiration moment? Like, was there a catch in a market disparity saying, hey, there's not something in the CPG space that's doing X, and what is that X factor? Or was it just kind of, let's see what we can throw at the wall and see what sticks?
No, it was a combination of factors. So Um, I got interested in supplements again, specifically because I was like very interested in health and performance from a personal perspective. I was fortunate to get connected with a guy that was on the performance training staff at the time of the local NFL team. And I was trying to get advice out of him about weightlifting specifically. We developed a great relationship. And
Was it for yourself?
all right,
Okay.
yeah, for myself. And, you know, weightlifting is a way to get faster, right? And uh, he really, in addition to teaching me a lot about strength training, he really imparted on me a lot of knowledge about nutrition and supplementation. And so I just kind of became obsessed with those things, as a lot of people in this space do. And I started getting all of my products from him. And he, among his other responsibilities at the team, in terms of sort of performance, was responsible for nutrition. This was before all the NFL teams had a or multiple registered dietitians on staff. And so this was one of his jobs. And what I noticed was that the supplements he was recommending for me, obviously were the same ones that he was buying for the guys on the team. And these were brands that I just didn't recognize. These were brands that were not available on the shelves at, Whole Foods, GNC, Vitamin Shop, name your supplement store. And at the time, neither on Amazon either. So these were companies that were largely selling through licensed practitioners, doctors and things of that nature. And when you sort of pushed him on why these products, he had all these really intricate answers around the sourcing of the ingredients and the form that they were in and the types of testing that they did on the products to ensure potency and that there wasn't anything else in there. And I'm like, that's really compelling. Like, why are these products not more popular with other people?
Right.
Like, I want that. I think a lot of my teammates and other folks out there would want that. And so that's kind of where the idea came from, in a sense, was, hey, why are these products not available more broadly? If we made products to this standard with sort of the validation from individuals like this gentleman, his name's Dave, we could probably make a compelling consumer brand out of that. And it turned out to be a lot more challenging than we thought, but that was sort of the original thesis.
Yeah, that's interesting. I run a health tech startup that does something semi-similar, not in CPG, but that was the whole thesis, was go towards the truly high performers that can then validate it for the rest. And the belief is like, oh, well, if you can get the high performers to validate it, then the rest will come, and like the longevity folk and the rest will believe that it's accurate.
Right.
So that was
you've
like
lived this, so you know how difficult that actually is to translate into consumer interest.
Yeah, because it's like then the distribution channel and like the form factor are so important. It's like, in one is like you're selling to this big enterprise team and you want to hyper personalize it, but now you're trying to sell to a mass consumer market that just wants to focus on brand. And we'll actually talk about that, I think, later. I'm just super interested in picking your brain a little bit about the brand side of things. But was that the key disparity? Was you saw that there was just high level supplements for some of these awesome teams and some of the highest performers that was not being offered to other teams and or other people, and popularizing that? Was that kind of the goal of the company? Was that the belief that would make it big?
Correct. There was essentially an information asymmetry as far as what the highest level athletes were looking for and expecting from their supplements versus what was important or available to consumers at that time.
Gotcha. Let's talk macro for a quick second. So CPG, I talked a little quick about my health tech company. And you analyze companies at Jazz, and so you probably see a lot of the players in the health and wellness longevity space. Do you think it's oversaturated, especially this day and age? You have a lot of people offering different features, and within supplementation, it's kind of getting hard to differentiate who's who and what's what and what's truly science backed. What's your kind of belief there, and what has just been the macro wins in terms of saturation in this market?
I kind of say yes to all of that. I think on one hand, I think the tailwinds for health and wellness, whether you just think about that as things like gym memberships or the consumerization of healthcare, is very much real. We did a lot of things really wrong at Momentus, learned a ton of lessons along the way. But I can say without a shadow of a doubt that there are more people today buying supplements and spending more money doing it than there were whatever, 8-10 years ago when we started that business. And we benefited from that. The tailwinds were and are today absolutely real. I expect that to continue. And so that I think is very much real. Is the market oversaturated? I would also say yes, but I don't think that applies to every corner of the market. Like, I think a lot of the low-hanging fruit in a lot of particularly consumer product categories, but also things that aren't benefiting from some type of very nascent technology, have essentially been fully exploited. And, we've gone through this great sort of Darwinian evolution now of consumer product brands, because it's, and services, consumer services to an extent
Yep.
as well, just because it's never been more easy to start a business. And so you have like whatever version of a product or service that you can imagine for this particular market, I guarantee somebody's tried to do it by now.
Yeah. On that point, I kind of want to get your thoughts on this, that there are some big players. I think you're wearing an Aura there. And
Yes.
so a bunch of like the hardware companies that are trying to go upstream, that are trying to just basically tackle a full encompassing kind of operating system, as opposed to niche. You touched on like niche approaches of like maybe super high tech or new breakthroughs in innovation in the tech that exists. But then there's those other companies that are growing, and like Aura just got valued at over $5 billion,
Mhm.
and it has that partnership with Dexcom, and now they're just really becoming this kind of full stack player. So when I say oversaturated, I'm also asking, the market's growing, right? People are loving this. Longevity is growing like crazy. You have movements like Blueprint and Brian Johnson, but
Mhm.
then you have companies like Aura that really start to squeeze up a lot of that market share. So when there are like startups or smaller companies that do hyper niche things, what has been your philosophy when either you're underwriting an investment or just analyzing a company, for your own sake, between, will this company be able to make it big, or will this company get eaten up by someone like Aura that has the distribution and has the hardware to kind of go distribute some of these new features and be that full operating system of health?
Yeah, it reminds me, I think the question you're asking reminds me a lot of the question that always comes up when you're looking at a SaaS investment, which is basically like, why doesn't Google or Microsoft just offer this as part of what they do already? Right.
Basically,
And
yeah.
so um, there's a certain part of me that says like that's always a risk. But I think if you were to try to underwrite it from first principles, you would look at whether or not the business in question has some type of strategic advantage underlying its business strategy. And I think the most popular framework for this is, I don't know if you've read like Helmer's Seven Powers, but that's a very popular framework for this, as far as like, cornered resources versus, scale economies, network effects, those types of things. Like what is it about the business that is going to give this company an advantage versus one of those incumbents, or more importantly, like what is it about the business that's going to make the big player, Apple, Samsung, whatever it is, not do this, or not do this for a very long time before you have the opportunity to establish a significant, brand or something of that nature.
Yeah, I mean, that part makes sense. But when you're underwriting the investment, are you really, like, is there any strong belief or justification of underwriting like a potential $1 billion business? Because that question for me stems from, you look at the health and wellness longevity space, there's maybe 3 or 4 companies that have reached that. First off, they're hardware most of the time. And second off, they now kind of own the market. And as people get into the space, that's kind of the first thing being thrown at them. And they are able to ship these new features. They're kind of still in that intermediary factor. They're not Google, they're not Apple, but they're, Whoop and Aura and these companies. And so when you underwrite a business and you underwrite the investment, is the belief that these companies, SaaS products or whatever else, will join these players and capture the projected CAGR, or is the belief that they kind of get integrated pretty early on and Aura and Whoop capture the market share as it grows?
I kind of look at those as two separate questions. Again, to the first component of it, of why doesn't one of the big players eat this startup's lunch? I come back to, what is the strategy? What is it about the business that's going to drive a durable competitive advantage for this company? And separately, the question of whether or not it can be a $1 billion business, like that is technically like what we're supposed to be underwriting as venture investors, but that doesn't necessarily need to be what you're trying to do as an entrepreneur. That doesn't make it a good or bad business just because it's a $1 billion opportunity or not. And to underwrite that specifically, I think you either need to look at the market that they're operating in and be able to see that there are hopefully several $1 billion plus enterprise value companies operating in that category already, or offering a competitive solution, even if it's not like exactly the same product. Or if that's not the case, because like clearly there are things that are new enough that wouldn't exist. There needs to be like a believable set of circumstances where, you know, the sort of bottoms up model of X number of customers spending this many dollars per month or per year would support an enterprise value of that size.
What do you think about the M&A market in this space specifically? Honestly, have not seen too much activity. So like as a venture investor, when you do underwrite that thesis, even if it gets that $1 billion valuation, what does that necessarily mean for you? I mean, I guess there's always the secondary play, but beyond that, I mean, have you heard of like potential talks of any kind of IPOs in that space? Is M&A prominent? I mean, what does that kind of look like?
You know, I can't say that I'm like the best expert to speak to what the late stage tech M&A or IPO market looks like specifically. I'll say, just as a disclaimer, we're investors in Aura, so I don't want to disclose anything specifically
Sure.
about that business other than to say that I think it does have the potential to be a prolific standalone business. I have seen quite a bit of M&A activity heating up recently, again, more in this like sort of better for you food and bev category, because basically what people are buying there at the end of the day is brand and distribution. And so there are lots of circumstances where it makes just all the sense in the world, I think, for a Nestle or a Unilever or a Coca-Cola or a P&G or even some of these other smaller publicly or privately owned sort of food conglomerates to say, why do we want to start this ourselves? Let's just go out and buy this thing. And I think the thing that I keep in mind there when I'm looking at those businesses is that the number of businesses which can reach sort of hundreds of millions in enterprise value versus billions in enterprise value is, I would say, probably 2 orders of magnitude larger as opposed to just 1. And so I would much prefer to invest in a business with the belief that it's going to get to, again, in that sort of CBG category specifically, with the belief that it's going to get into the sort of hundreds of millions of enterprise value and then try to sell business, as opposed to needing the underwriting to sort of pencil out to, hey, this only makes sense for us if we can get to $1 billion in enterprise value. Because the story for an acquirer of how do we take a $500 million business and make it $1 billion business is so much dramatically easier for them to wrap their heads around and to actually do in practice too, as opposed to the story of how do we take a, $1 billion business and make it a $5 billion business.
You talked about something that's kind of interesting to me that I see a lot in the CPG companies and health and wellness specifically is distribution and brand. Those are 2 big things, but when we look at this a little bit more from first principles, this health and wellness train or even just industry or even CPG and food and bev should be focused, especially if the brand is aligned with that, to be science-backed and actually net positive for your health. And I think there's an often disparity here. And so when you were building Momentus, or even now when you see other people build CPG companies, how do you go about thinking about that trade-off? I think it's a really common one. I face this all the time. I talk to a bunch of other founders that are potentially farther along in that Series B stage where they built a great brand and everyone loves it. But if you were to go do a deep dive analysis on the science, it doesn't always add up. And so you've built a brand, you built distribution, but you might not actually be contributing to the core of like, hey, we make you healthier in X. So how do you think about that trade-off with both the investment side or when you were building Momentus?
I actually really want to hear like more of what you're referencing specifically as far as the disparity that you're seeing. But I think another way to ask that question is like, if you're looking at an investment or looking at starting a company, like which is more important, I suppose, like a great brand or excellent scientific validation or effects? Does that sort of equate to
Yeah,
what you're
yeah. I
saying?
mean, the reality is it's often a trade-off where you have to like, hey, am I going to focus on my social media strategy, or am I going to focus the next year on going into a lab and making truly like testing edge cases? Because the reason healthcare moves so slow is because they test so many edge cases, and as much as it's still not personified by any means, um, you really are trying to make sure that there's not much death or like liability and all these kinds of other things, as opposed to something I've seen in health and wellness a bunch, where I'm creating a CPG company that claims to, improve your gut microbiome, or I'm, creating a software that tracks your glucose, and they're not always necessarily aligned. And so you founders often have to choose: is like, do I want to build this brand, or do I want to spend the next year building one of the best products and being just completely off the grid? And I find that kind of interesting. So I don't know if Momentus, if you had this debate in your head or how you went about doing that, if like sales first or science first. Um, but or even investments that you've seen and made, like how have founders thought about that, and how have you had those conversations with them?
I feel like I've lived this like at least twice now, and now probably on a couple of boards as well. But I look at it through a slightly different lens that I don't think you're necessarily making the trade-off of like science investing in clinical studies, for example, equals a better product. And you're doing that at the margins in place of spending dollars and energy on sales and marketing. Like, I don't think that having, for a lot of products, like having clinical studies, particularly for a consumer product, doesn't necessarily make the product better. And like the example I would give would be, these aren't hugely differentiated necessarily, but like, a company that's offering a hypertrophy program versus a VO2 max training program, et cetera. What is the benefit for them to invest in clinical studies to support the science behind that product? I would say that it's probably very, very low, frankly, because I actually think that the product is basically providing value for the consumer and the value that they want for the consumer. Like, it's solving a real consumer problem, regardless of what the studies say or don't say, frankly. And
And
the way that
interesting.
we've lived it more specifically is like when there are, um, products that we're selling that we know have a terrific effect, uh, but perhaps they're not proprietary, certain ingredients or things of that nature. And so, if we go out and invest in the clinical research around, I don't know, ashwagandha or something like that, right? Every company that sells ashwagandha is going to benefit from that essentially equally, right? Versus, we're the ones that spent all of the money to fund that
Right.
research.
But
And so for
that
those
that
types of companies, it's like, you know, honestly, it's like maybe not the most compelling answer for a consumer to hear, but I would say like the only thing that matters really from a business perspective is does the customer want that product, and is it solving the customer's problem, regardless of what the science might say or not say.
and that's kind of my root question is like, do you not think that's slightly problematic? Yeah, I mean, you kind of made an interesting point. Is like, yeah, ashwagandha. I know now the most popularized strain, like KSM 66, and that was the most studied, if you will, because a few reports came out there, and some of the bigger kind of health and wellness influencers said that was the most science backed. But like then no one will take the plunge, right? So if we're only saying that once one person validates it, it helps the whole industry. Although that's true, that person then has to kind of take a loss, just because they're the ones putting in the capital to go do that. First off, and
Well,
second off,
that company did research because they had that KSM 66 company, the company behind that ingredient, that's their proprietary ingredient, right? And so their business is selling it to other businesses as opposed to selling it directly to consumers. So they were essentially not unilaterally, but they were definitely the majority beneficiaries of the research that they did. Like, still there's a rising tide effect for that particular ingredient. If more people are talking about it, they may still go buy some other generic source of the ingredient, but it definitely benefited them the most.
Sure. Yeah. From that perspective, okay. But the thing I find interesting is I think there's two phases to software specifically in the health and wellness space is like providing the data and then telling you what to do with the data. So like, hey, here are your levels on X. Here's the things I would do to improve specific to you. And that's where I think science backed. So when we talk about CPG, if I'm saying the goal of this drink is to detoxify your body and help do things in that space, it's often hard to prove and it's one phase. But when I'm providing two phases and I'm providing data and the actionable portion, it's a little bit easier to use a gold standard and say, hey, are these accurate? So like if, to make this a little more granular, say someone's doing something non-invasively and there's an invasive gold standard. So benchmarking it across that. And the second is like the actionable insight is analyzing people over time. And so when one prioritizes the brand from a business perspective, like you made the point, obviously it's better for the venture side of things. It's better for the business. Where my question is right now, health and wellness is growing like crazy. Like people are obsessed with longevity. It's growing. But if we look at this in 10 years, where I see a potential huge problem is if people haven't actually felt the effects. And that could be very possible because maybe people spend so much time growing the brand and not the actual efficacy of what they're building. Like some of the companies that have done really well, Whoop and Aura, and right, they publish a lot of peer review studies and like they do a lot of science-backed things. But the second part that a lot of the companies have not done well yet, even these bigger players, is what if someone acts upon this advice or what if someone acts upon the data that you're providing? How does that look? And what if they're taking your, like there's all these AI personal trainers and all these kinds of things. And personal training is one thing, but like changing, I don't know, the way I eat and like CGM is recommending that I eat certain foods or don't. And in 10 years, I'm actually unhealthier than I was before. I'm not saying that's going to be the case. Likely it won't. But if I focus on brand rather than the science, that's something totally feasible. So I think that's a scary thing in this space. And as a consumer, it's hard to evaluate what's true and not. So without the peer review studies, you kind of don't know what is the top player other than the person that's the loudest with the biggest brand.
Yeah. Like my advice would be, don't be the first to try something generally. Something that's not, gone through any type of significant research. But I think we don't have the worst system in the world here. Like, I'm not saying that it's like perfect by any means, but, we have significant economic incentives for people to develop solutions for this space for both regulated and unregulated products. And again, you can decide for yourself whether or not we make the right delineation there, but we do make a delineation in terms of what is considered a disease claim versus what is not considered a disease claim. And there's a very high bar to introduce a therapeutic, and there's a much lower bar to introduce something that, for the most part, we don't view as having a lot of potential to cause harm. Just like, the FDA hasn't, for the most part, gone after anybody selling, these CGM products to people off-label, right? Because, I guess, again, in an extreme circumstance, maybe somebody gives themselves like an eating disorder or something like that. But really, for the most part, you're just not going to see a lot of public harm come out of people that are not diabetics using that product. And so what I'm saying is that, like, is it like, are people going to like try shit that's not good for them? And are people going to take things to extreme? Yeah, 100%. Like, you need to do your research. And again, I generally recommend don't be the first to try something, but I just generally believe we're at a net positive. Like, the economic incentives to make these types of better for you products for people, both in the consumer and, again, sort of regulated spaces, I think are very good and net positive.
Where my slight problem occurs is I don't, maybe I won't cite examples of this, but you could create a placebo product that does phenomenally in selling the brand, or even like, I don't think it's a bad thing necessarily.
Yeah, so you trick consumers, right? You trick consumers. Yeah. And so that company's either not going to succeed in the long term. Maybe the FTC will go after them, and maybe they won't, and they're going to dupe a bunch of consumers. But if they cause significant harm apart from just like taking people's money, then there's probably going to be consequences for them.
So do you think regulatory does a good job of this so far in this specific industry of checking like what is, because there's a pretty fine line of like what needs to be FDA approved versus what's performance optimization and suggestions. Do you think there's a good regulatory environment for that kind of thing?
Oh man, it's a really good question.
It can be so hard when there's so many, like, I've gone through this of saying, hey, we're providing results versus we're providing suggestions and performance optimization feedback. And so just even a slight wording can create scenarios where I don't have to get
Yeah.
regulated, but I'm providing pretty valuable information that could be problematic, regardless of like diabetic, not diabetic, or any kind of health conditions.
Yeah. To be perfectly honest, I'm like, again, I'm curious your answer. Like, I'm of sort of two minds about it, where, um, on one hand, I can point to a large number of circumstances where the FDA has clearly not done a good job, right? Like, earlier this week, you had the banning of red dye number 3, right? And that was banned in cosmetics for 35 years previously and has basically never been allowed in Europe. We don't know whether that causes cancer in humans or not, caused cancer in mice. And so it seemed like that risk wasn't worth taking. And, what's the economic upside to having that product in the market? I would argue not nearly high enough to justify
Right.
that remaining out there. So there's countless instances where clearly, we haven't done a good enough job. The other part of my mind is one of like, hey, relative to the span of history and likely many other places that you could live in the world, this is a relatively safe place to be. Almost every product you find on the shelf is not going to kill you. We have a remarkable system, and it's all relative in a certain respect. And so I have this sort of free market part of my brain as well that says, the answer I gave to you earlier, which is like, hey, if those are shit products, then they'll be shit businesses, and in the span of time, they
Sure.
won't stick around.
That's super fair. I want to segue a little bit into Sett because you're going through some of these questions that you're actively
Yeah,
answering
totally,
as
totally.
as you're building a company. So give us just so we can poke it a little bit more, but like specifically kind of what are you building, or at least whatever you
Yeah.
can share. What is Sett? What's kind of what takes up most of your time nowadays?
Yeah, totally. It's a consumer product, and it's in a category that is both, um, regulated, but also available over the counter. And so essentially what we're building at Sett is a superior nicotine alternative. So think of a product like, for those familiar, Zyn pouch is the most popular product on the market today. These are what are called modern oral pouches in industry parlance, or they're essentially just these, um, you know, porous pouches that contain basically nicotine and flavors, and you put them in between your gums and your lip, and you absorb the active ingredients, nicotine in this instance, through your mucosal lining as opposed to through inhalation. And that's a much better alternative to a lot of other products on the market, because you don't have to burn anything, right,
Nice.
in order to get the product into the air and into your lungs. And so the first kind of manifestation of better for you tobacco products, right, was like e-cigarettes and Juul. And turns out those have a bunch of health consequences to them. The second iteration or wave of this that we're seeing is in these oral products. And that could also be like gums or lozenges, but the most popular form factor by far is pouches. And the downside to these products is that, um, uh, you know, on one hand, they're not carcinogenic, they're not mutagenic, the way that burning a tobacco product is. On the other hand, um, you know, they still have a really, interesting set of positive and negative side effects to them. And in particular, I think what you find when you speak with people that use these products regularly is that they love the sort of energy and rush that they give them. But they also find that, on one hand, the product is very habit forming. Nicotine is
Right.
still obviously extremely addictive. And, it leads to a lot of, sort of unnecessary reliance. And in particular, I think it leads to a lot of like energy swings, mood swings. I don't know if you've used these types of products, but those are like very
I actually
popular,
have.
side effects of using nicotine very regularly. And so what we wanted to do was try to create a product that was a better alternative to those. So it was going to satisfy a nicotine user's fix by binding to nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, but we would try to address a lot of the sort of withdrawal and also sort of energy spikes and crashes through the design of the product. And the thing about this category is that the regulatory environment is such that it's essentially commercially impossible to introduce a new nicotine or tobacco product from scratch. The FDA views those as one and the same, regardless of whether it's a pouch or a cigarette. So it's extremely difficult. And the products that are on the market today can't modify their formulas in any way whatsoever without basically invalidating the authorization that they have already. And so there's a whole story again of how our formulation exactly came together. But essentially, in order to create the product that we wanted to create, which was a superior alternative to what's on the market, we had to look beyond traditional nicotine.
Interesting. So you guys have gone, I mean, the first few steps is like pretty deeply going into habit and addiction and kind of working with consumers that suffer from those. And is the thesis to break habit and addiction and that healthy alternative creates a situation where you don't need it anymore? Or it's to create a product that's just a healthier, but yet still relatively addictive kind of form factor?
Yeah, so I'll preface this by saying that I am absolutely not a medical expert or an expert in addiction in any way. But obviously I've used a lot of these products personally. A lot of people in my network, in my office, and my family have used these products. And the belief that I have personally is that these products have a really unfair reputation publicly. For a long time, and still to the most part today, nicotine and tobacco have been viewed as inextricably connected. And when you look at the science behind those products, that's not really fair, because tobacco is carcinogenic and nicotine is addictive, but not carcinogenic. And I think reasonable people can agree or disagree on whether or not something being addictive makes it inherently bad for you. And
That gets
nicotine
into a
has a
pretty
bunch of
philosophical
sort of,
topic.
yeah, and nicotine has a bunch of sort of interesting, sort of, again, positive and negative side effects to it as well. It's a very well-studied cognitive enhancer. It's a mild appetite suppressant. As a stimulant, it has a shorter half-life than something like caffeine, so it doesn't disrupt your sleep in quite the same way that caffeine does. And again, unlike, let's say sugar, alcohol, those types of things, doesn't give you liver disease, doesn't give you metabolic disease, doesn't give you cancer. Again, side effects I'd say are much less bad. And my view is that because it's much less bad than a lot of other things that we view as socially acceptable, I kind of think people are basically going to continue using these products whether you like it or not, whether or not you think it's good for them or not. And so why not make a healthier product that is also a more compelling user experience and give them something better?
That's fair. Yeah.
That's
I mean,
essentially my take on it. And again, I think some people will have a very viscerally negative reaction to that, and that's okay. But I think that, look, exercise is addictive, right?
yeah. I mean,
Lots of positive things can be addictive too. And it's a spectrum, right? And I just think that something like nicotine and our compound, which is called serotonin, are just not nearly as bad as the public perception would indicate.
Yeah. I mean, it kind of blurs the lines between habit, addiction. At what point do you get into one versus do you get into the other? So how deep into kind of that process have you guys gotten with working with you? I mean, is this out in the market? Have you guys worked with people? And is that one thing I'm super interested is there's a lot of healthy alternatives that come out, but there's always some trade-off that happens, whether that's like taste, not always, but obviously the ones that don't have a trade-off do really, really well. But whether that's like taste or health or something, and this clearly seems, especially based on the science you roughly mentioned, that it's a healthier alternative. What's the trade-off, or if there even is one, for users that are already using something like Zins?
So just for the context, again, we're creating a pouch product that from the outside will look a lot like a Zyn. It will have a high strength version and a low strength version of our proprietary active, which is called serotonin. And we're also including 80 milligrams of L-theanine, which is an amino acid in that product as well. And I'll get into sort of the rationale there. But serotonin specifically is what you'd call an alkaloid. So it is in the same class of compounds as a nicotine. It differs by only, I want to say, 4 or 5 atoms. So it's structurally very, very similar, but it is chemically distinct from nicotine. So it's not like, oh, hey, rebranded nicotine. It genuinely isn't nicotine. It is actually a different chemical compound. And I would say from the research we have, and in particular, we have data on, we have data on 2 things. So we have, 3 things. So we have toxicity data. We have receptor binding affinity data. And then we have dissolution data in the work. But we have a strong thesis already on sort of the dissolution of the product specifically. On the toxicity side, it is effectively, it's slightly better than nicotine in the way our product is formulated, meaning that it takes slightly more of our product, a ridiculously high amount, right? Like there's no practical way that you could consume this much product and like kill yourself with it, but these are still tests that are important to do. So it's roughly equivalent there. It's slightly stronger, actually, in terms of its propensity to bind to your nicotinic acetylcholine receptors than nicotine on a molar basis. And so we dilute it such that it has roughly equivalent strength to what somebody, a nicotine user, would be used to. And then on the dissolution side, we don't have that data yet, but we have a very strong thesis because our experience with it, and this is, I would say, both a positive and a trade-off for some consumers, is that the way the product is designed with respect to the other actives that are in there, the moisture content of the product, and then potentially the nature of the active ingredient itself is such that it doesn't hit you quite as hard or quite as quickly. Like I would say that anybody who's used a product like Zyn knows that it can be like kind of overwhelming in the first 10 minutes. It can hit you really, really hard. And then, in another 10 minutes, you basically go off a cliff and you want another one, right? Because now you're, like people describe that with caffeine, right? It's a similar dynamic. Ours is, I would say, like just a much smoother experience. And you'd have to do much longer term studies in order to validate this. But our belief is that if you don't create such a high spike followed by such a significant crash, that you will create a less addictive product that still sort of achieves the effect you're looking for as far as the interaction with those receptors in your brain.
From a business side, then, if it creates a potentially less addictive product and things kind of just start mellowing out more and more, the same could be said about caffeine and people trying to go less and less caffeine and they still never really fade out. But is then the long-term goal for the end user to completely mellow out? Or is the goal just to have a healthier alternative that they still continue with because that becomes the new baseline?
I think that's up to the consumer. Again, our expectation is that people want to use these products. They'll continue to use these products. And in particular, they'll continue to use them because there's a significant cohort of people that use them responsibly. They use them for a function as opposed to specifically like as a, social stimulant like a college kid would.
Yeah.
And so for those people, we think we just have a more compelling user experience. And for the college kid that's pairing this with a Bud Light or 30 rack of Bud Light on the weekends, frankly, we're probably not as good of a product for them. Like we don't solve their problem as effectively.
How do you guys, kind of going back to some of the questions we talked about earlier with like the, just reference for logistical purposes, you guys are in stealth still, or are you kind of hitting the market?
No, we're going to be in the market next month.
Oh, wow. Okay. Super exciting.
Yeah.
So as you went about building it, you have dug into the science a little bit and some of the validation that you've done, at least from a research perspective. but how have you thought about building this specific brand slightly differently than Momentus, especially because it starts to dabble in like that addiction and space, um, ethical drawbacks or like ethical lines or even just like building it from a science base to a brand based. How have you gone about making, I don't know if necessarily trade-offs, but just like what have been some of those thought processes and conversations you guys have had internally?
Well, I think the biggest mistake that we made at Momentus from day one was that um, I assumed I was a good representative of the customer. And it turned out that that was not true at all. So what we've done differently here from the start is we've been extremely focused on customer interviews and understanding what problem it is that we're trying to solve for a particular consumer. And again, for the sort of social nicotine user, somebody that's using this, you know, again, on sort of the weekends at parties or things like that, a better solution for them would be a higher dose nicotine product. We're thinking about somebody that probably has a history of use with nicotine products. We're thinking about somebody that uses these products in place of an energy drink or coffee or another nootropic. And we think that we can address a lot of those, again, those downsides with respect to, not only sort of the mood and energy swings, but also potentially some of the withdrawal symptoms. L-theanine has a lot of research to support that from a number of different substances. And then the stigma as well associated with these types of products, given that what we're offering is not nicotine and we think is going to have terrific scientific validation over time. So
Awesome.
I'd say the biggest difference by far is like, we've just like way more invested in user interviews and research early on here in trying to validate the problem with customers.
Yeah, I think it's often one of the key fallacies is you're often taught to go build for yourself. And then if you don't realize that you might not actually be your ICP.
But what if you're weird as hell?
Yeah. What
There's nobody like, then
that's
fair.
That's fair.
Shouldn't
Yeah,
listen
that's
to your
fair.
opinion, right? And I want to address like the sort of like ethical thing too. Again, our position is people are going to use these products. And I believe that the products on the market today are already vastly healthier alternatives to something like smoking. But I think they've used nicotine for millennia. I think people are going to continue to use it. I think this is a healthier way for them to do it. So that's how I feel about it personally. I fully recognize and respect that other people may feel differently about that. But I think that pretty much every consumer product, whether or not it's obvious to you as a consumer, is designed to be addictive.
That's fair. Yeah.
So
especially, anything reoccurring kind of has to be. That makes sense. That's super fair.
So like what's the downside? Maybe it looks like our product is more addictive on the surface, but like, okay, what about all of the mobile games on your phone? Yeah. What about all the social media apps? Like, those aren't addictive by accident.
Right. Although for different reasons, not the addictive reasons, as we speak a few days ago, or today, the TikTok is taken down. So some activity in some of those bigger social media players. Where can people find Sett if they want to go check it out?
So again, we'll be available at the end of February. It's getsett.co. And Sett is spelled with 2 T's. So it's GETSETT.co. And similar social media handles everywhere.
Awesome. I want to jump into a quick rapid fire with you, if you don't mind. I'll ask you a question and just give me kind of the first thing that comes to mind.
Okay.
What drives you most?
Just creating an excellent life for myself and my family and future kids.
What's something you believe that most people don't?
I'm tempted to say like nicotine is an incredible nootropic.
That's funny.
Given everything we've talked about today. Sorry, you said rapid fire, so you said first thing that comes to mind, right?
That's perfect. What's the most exciting longevity startup? Or one of the? I know you invest in some, so I don't want to make you pick an exact one, but what's one that comes to mind?
I'll say one that I find really exciting. One of our companies, not because I think it's necessarily going to have like the most extraordinary population level outcomes. But we invested in this company called Eternal, and they're focused on athletic longevity. And what I think is compelling about it from a business perspective is that they are focused on consumers who are extraordinarily motivated. Most of the time, again, you go through one of these longevity-like services and they say you need to eat less and exercise more.
Yeah.
These are people who, for whom like exercise or training or sport is like their primary hobby, right? And so they're super motivated and passionate about what it is that you're offering. And again, like I'm not saying that is necessarily like going to change the world, but I just find that exciting as a consumer, and I'm really excited for that entrepreneur and that business, just because it's so fun to work with customers that want to be helped.
Yeah. No, and there's a disparity there too, because there's a lot of longevity stuff for the everyday folk, but it's a little bit harder just because it's gets more complex when people are actually already healthy and you don't just tell them the obvious things.
Yeah.
That's awesome. What is your biggest regret?
Um, I don't know, probably not doing computer science in third grade.
So, um, uh, just the last one here. What were your parents' philosophies when they raised you?
I would say that if I look back, I feel like my parents gave me like an extraordinary amount of trust and freedom to make my own decisions and make my own mistakes. And that is something I'm really thankful for.
Often makes a good entrepreneur. It's been great having the podcast. And yeah, thank you for taking the time.
No, thank you.